This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Katherine Shen. What can smell tell us about our world? For centuries, smell has been used to empower, disempower, and tell stories about humanity. Smell can speak to different aspects of our culture, identity, and lived realities. From plagues to prisons and personhood, our noses are a window into a world that's often underappreciated and deeply misunderstood. So, let's get nosy. Joining us today to explore all things smell are Brittany Cozier. She's the owner of the perfume pop-up shop Fauheline Parfumerie. Thank you so much for joining us today, Brittany.
Thank you so much for having me.
And also with us is Dr. Ali Lukes, who is known for her viral thesis, Olfactory Ethics, the Politics of Smell in Modern and Contemporary Prose. Ali, appreciate you joining us as well.
Thank you for having me.
And so, Ali, I'm going to start with you here because you've researched smells very extensively. Can you give us an idea of what olfactory is and what's so distinctive about smell compared to sight and hearing?
So, olfaction is our chemical sense. It's one of our two chemical senses. Smell and taste are both chemical senses. And what is different about smell, I suppose, what sets it apart, is that it's considered a kind of irrational sense in comparison to sight and hearing. And that's because it is very, very subjective. And it's also very deeply emotive, which is quite a volatile combination of things. And although we're constantly smelling every time we take a breath, most of this goes beneath our conscious awareness. So we're not really used to thinking consciously or critically about smell.
We're only about a minute in, but I'm already thinking I'm going to change the way I smell things every breath I take. And Brittany, you're the only niche perfume pop-up owner here in Connecticut, but I want to start at the beginning as well with you here. What first sparked your interest in fragrance?
You know, I have my late grandmother was a woman of taste, and she had her signature scent, and she always wore the same perfume. And it reminds me of her so much. She even used to, there's a very popular trend right now, scent layering, where people will spray, different parts of their clothes and outfits. And my grandmother was doing that ages ago. She would even spray her homemade scrunchies with her perfume so that she would just leave this beautiful scent trail. And I think what sparked or renewed my interest, I should say, is sort of my quest to find out what perfume that was, because she passed away some years ago now. And sometimes you just want to revisit that memory. As Dr. Luke said, it's incredibly tied to memory. And sometimes you want to revisit those. So I was able to figure out the scent that she wore, and thankfully it's still available. It's been around since 1952. It's called Wind Song. I believe you can buy it in, any sort of department store. And although it's not something that I particularly like to smell like for myself, it is something that I can just spray once, either on a test strip or the back of my hand, and be reminded of my grandmother. So that quest to figure out what she wore was sort of what renewed my interest in fragrance.
I'm really glad to hear the success of your quest, because we love a successful quest. And what's the fragrance like? What are some of the notes that particular that touches your memory?
Yeah, if you look up the notes, there are quite a few of them. But I will say that it's quite a powdery vintage profile. There's a lot of carnation, which is, I think, notes are mostly marketing, really. But carnation, or the aroma chemical used to create that smell, is something that is not used a lot currently, just because it is quite a sort of like powdery vintage profile that not enough of people appreciate still. But it's sort of peppery and very floral, a little powdery. It's really lovely. It's just not something I like to smell like for myself, sure. But I do love smelling it. Yes.
Well, and Ali, there's so much association between smell and memory, and as Brittany just shared too, I feel like there's I think collectively we all have that moment, or all have that scent that like jogs the memory of something, maybe something from yesterday, but maybe something from 20 years ago. Can you tell us a bit more about that association between scent and memory?
Yeah, this is something that authors throughout the past century and longer even have been really interested in recording for us. Um, so the reason that smell is so connected with memory is because the olfactory cortex is directly linked with the limbic system in the brain, which is the part of the brain that deals with emotion and memory. And unlike other senses, which kind of have to go the long way round to be processed by the limbic system, olfaction is like directly connected. And so we have these memories associated with smell that get tagged by an emotion and they kind of last indefinitely. So there are lots of examples, for instance, of people suffering with Alzheimer's disease who can still remember these very specific memories that are tied to smells, even though they can't even remember their own loved ones. Yeah.
Well, and that no, that's amazing because it's for the, I mean, based on the example that you just shared, that's a very powerful, evocative thing to experience when you can't remember anything else, but that scent is just that strong. And is that something that you've come across a lot from your research?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, the kind of the example that I think is maybe most prominent in the cultural imagination is Proust, Marcel Proust, In Search of Lost Time, where he says that smells and tastes are able to bear the immense edifice of memory when nothing else subsists from the past, and that is prompted by this experience that he has with a tea-soaked Madeleine cake,
Mm.
which yeah, I mean, but in Sean Shu's book, his most recent one, Olfactory World Making, he suggests that there are lots of other different ways that this can happen across cultures, and that certain, I would love to let him speak later, but he suggests that some people, especially immigrants, for instance, are not able to access those memories because those flavor profiles aren't as easily accessed within certain cultures.
Appreciate the preview. We will be speaking with Sean Shu in a little bit. And so I'm going to ask everyone to bear with me for a moment because I do have a sample from our wonderful intern, Davina, who provided me with a sample of a perfume that I'm going to spritz real quick and see what it evokes. And I'm sorry that you can't hear it, but I'm going to do my best to describe what it smells like. So this is a scent called Naked Dance, and it's an olfactory impression of our lives at home. And I'm kind of pointing my hand to the mic, and I don't know why, because I feel like you can smell it if I did it this way. And so the description of this of the scent is actually impression of lives at home where we jazz through space filled with our attachments, memories, and comforts in bliss of intimate liberty to be ourselves. So I feel like I just chose a scent that is perfect for what we were just talking about. And it has sort of a little bit of a floral scent. And it does kind of remind me of the comforts of home. And Ali, especially with what you just shared, just how evocative perfume can be. Can you tell us a little bit more about the historical aspects of fragrance? Because there's, through history, we have bad air, miasma from plague times. This is part of your research and how plague doctors used to fill their masks with good smelling things like lavender, for example. How have the ways we interact with fragrance changed over time?
Oh gosh. Well, the thing is, smell is as long as human history itself. Since time immemorial, humans have smelled in both senses of the words. We've been smelling things and we've been smelly. So to talk about the history of smell is really to talk about the history of humanity. And so that's, part of why I'm so interested in smell is because it has shaped our identities for thousands and thousands of years. It was the first sense to develop back in the, primordial era. So it really is that ancient. Um, but the history of smell has really been shaped by a variety of different kind of myths and social factors, which have kind of coalesced over many hundreds, if not thousands of years to align smell with things that are not really privileged in many societies. Things like the feminine, the animal, the so-called savage, and kind of the other in general.
I'm still smelling the scent that I smelled earlier and trying to figure out what else I'm smelling. And so while I'm doing that, Brittany, because you sell perfumes from like niche and indie fragrance houses, can you tell me why you choose to highlight whatever you choose to highlight?
Absolutely. So I think a lot of the modern world has a very Eurocentric view on perfumery and fragrance. I think France is one of the most well-known centers for perfumery, but the reality is that perfume and perfumery have been around for ages, and it is not something that is so central to France historically. So although you have to recognize their part in modern perfumery, I think there's a lot of people, a lot of experiences, a lot of cultures that are traditionally underrepresented in perfumery. And you find a lot of those in the niche and indie space. So going back to, excuse me, going back to what Ali said about Sean's work, about immigrants and they don't have the same access to the olfactory profiles that they had at home. There's a house that I would love to carry in the future, called Miti Parfum, and Miti in Hindi means soil, and it is owned by a wonderful couple named Ridhima and Nirav, and they make perfume that is meant to tie directly back to their culture, to their home, and they use a lot of olfactory profiles that you don't necessarily see in a lot of, sort of like I said, Eurocentric perfume. So they have, uh, gosh, off the top of my head, they have a scent called Rani Pink, which is meant to evoke sort of youthfulness all the way through adulthood. And it has notes like bubblegum, but it also has spiced notes like clove, and it sort of bridges the gap. So it's, I believe, don't quote me on this one, but I believe Rani in Hindi means royalty. So it's just sort of this like perfect mixture of something fun and youthful, all the way through something very regal. And those are the sorts of stories they create. And it's not just Midi Parfum that's doing that. There are so many wonderful, independently owned brands that are creating those olfactive stories, and tying it back to their cultures. So that's part of what draws me to niche and indie perfume.
Well, as I'm still trying to figure out what I'm smelling here, I'm definitely getting a little sort of a sort of warm muskiness, if that makes sense. And with what you just shared, and this is something that I feel like, as we mentioned earlier, scent, smell, it's so underrated when it comes to relating it to storytelling or history and whatnots. And you're talking about highlighting sense that expresses cultural identity and various experiences. Why do you think it's important for you to be able to provide that for your customers or people kind of flowing through? How have they reacted to the sense that they were smelling in your shop?
Yeah, I think that for me, it would be it would be easy for anyone to just sort of start selling perfume and just sell whatever is popular and what most people know about. And to a certain degree, I think that is inevitable. My goal is to have a brick and mortar location, but continue doing pop-ups.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a certain sort of inevitability of carrying those fragrances that people are very familiar with. But I think for me, perfumery is very much an art form, one that I think sometimes gets brushed off, especially in some online spaces, as, it's just perfume, right? It's just water that smells good. And I think that's really doing it a disservice, because there's so many ways it can help people reconnect with their own culture, either through the process of making it or the process of smelling it. Um, it can, not only remind you of memories that you hold, but it can create new memories. So anytime I do something big or important, I always remember what scent I wore that day, because it's just, I like to create new memories in that sense. So for me, I think I would be doing everyone, including myself, a disservice if I didn't try to platform some of those houses that have these really cool stories to tell, and they're making incredible art. And I want to do my part, however small, in helping spread the word about those.
Well, I love that, because as you're describing sort of your experiences, I'm thinking there are scents, I think, throughout my life that I wish I can bottle, but I can't really exactly tell you what I'm smelling. Maybe it's like the smell of home, or like the smell of something that is indescribable. So we're gonna have to figure out a way how to bottle that. But Ali, before we go to break, just based on what Brittany just shared, what does this say about how people devalue smell? We were talking about how important it is as a part of all of our identities, but it's not really the first. It's not really the first thing that people, I think, value.
Yeah, I think that's true. And the kind of history of that is really long. So we have prominent philosophers like Aristotle and Plato and Kant all having really negative things to say about smell, and prominent scientists like Charles Darwin and Paul Broca also making these kind of mistaken claims about smell that have entered our cultural consciousness. And so in lieu of kind of proper science, what has happened is that these myths have arisen in kind of in response to these ideas. And those myths are things like that we as humans aren't very good at smelling in comparison to other animals, when in fact that's not the case. When we've actually studied human olfaction, it has been revealed that we're actually really, really good at smelling in comparison to most other animals. And in fact, we can even rival dogs in a third of the aroma chemicals that were tested. Another myth is that smell doesn't do very much for us, that it's kind of unnecessary. And I think one way of thinking about kind of dispelling that particular myth is thinking about how much it contributes to flavor perception. So, depending on the thing that you're eating, smell contributes about 80 to 95% of flavor perception. So, when I ask my students which sense they would most like to give up if they had to give up a sense, they usually say smell. And then the foodies,
Oh no.
those one, they're like, hang on, but if I give up smell, then will I not be able to taste anything? And in most situations, that's pretty true. I lost my sense of smell for about 18 months during the pandemic, and it was a really trying experience because food lost all of its flavor and life lost a lot of its color because of that. And so I've been really interested in learning about smell training since then, and I've realized that actually smell training has amazing benefits both for our mental health and for our kind of cognitive health as well. So it's a really complex social phenomenon, but it is very much driven by a misunderstanding of the sense of smell.
Well, I'm really glad you brought up food, because I think that's probably one of the first things we think of when we're talking about scent is from food rather than as water, as Brittany described. And we'll be talking more about this throughout the hour. But Brittany, we're going to say bye to you pretty quickly here, but I just want to leave you some time with some final thoughts for our listeners. And what would you like to leave behind with our listeners today?
I actually usually just like to sort of spread the good word about one of my favorite houses, which is Alloy Studio. They're out of New York, owned by a queer Black couple. They make scents rooted in things like going back to food. They have a sweet potato pie fragrance. and fragrance is based off of the first Black supermodel, Danya Luna. And I always encourage people to check them out because they make some of the most incredible art. So that is what I will leave you with today.
Well, we appreciate that so much. You've been listening to Brittany Cozaire, who's the owner of the pop-up perfumery Foheline. Follow her on Instagram and TikTok at Foheline Parfumer for her events. So thank you so much for joining us today, Brittany. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And Dr. Ali Lukes will be staying with us after a quick break. This is Where We Live. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Perfume, politics, power. It's something you probably haven't thought too much about, but smells are with us every day. From prose to politics, smells can conjure images of cherished memories and use to project power. Today, we're exploring the world of scent and all the hidden ways it influences our everyday lives. Dr. Ali Lukes is still with us. She's a supervisor at the University of Cambridge and author of the viral thesis, Olfactory Ethics. And joining us now is Alexandra Siegel, who's a recent Wesleyan anthropology graduate who studied smell. Alexandra, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And also we have Sean Shu, who's a professor of English at UC Davis and also author of The Smell of Risk and Olfactory World Making. Sean, appreciate you joining us as well.
Thanks, Catherine. Happy to be here.
So, Sean, we heard from Brittany earlier about the way that smells can be used to showcase and communicate aspects of identity and culture. But you've also talked about how scent has been used to other people, especially those who are in marginalized communities. Can you elaborate more on that?
Yeah, so I mean, this is partly related to the history of deodorization, which was like part of the process of modernization in the West. Everything from street paving to different kinds of infrastructure, moving sewage sites out of cities, that was seen as like really integral to civilization, right? And as a kind of effect of that, you had this kind of like olfactory stigmatization of people who, either were associated with smells that were seen as improper or who might not be totally in control of their bodily smells. So like if one smelled like sweat or, different kinds of work sites, that people would be, like seen as other, as less than based on smells. So that's one mode of olfactory subjugation, but at the same time, there's also what Ali was talking about earlier, which is this idea that like, caring about smell or seeing smell as a valid sense of knowledge or as like coming to know the world, is also something that has been seen as kind of like less civilized, associated with kind of like animal or irrational tendencies.
Well, I think it's pretty amazing to we started talking about how scent evokes memories. That's very personal for many of us. But now we're talking about a much broader framework of what scent can influence. And Sean, you frequently talk about olfactory in that framework of, racialization, Orientalism, and settler colonialism. Can you explain to us in basic terms of what that means and how it's connected to what you refer to as olfactory violence?
Yeah, thank you. So, olfactory violence and racialization, there's so many aspects to it. I mean, like one of the primordial sites would be the hold of the slave ship, right, where smell was like deliberately weaponized in order to dehumanize, demoralize enslaved people who, were just like held, like packed very close together, and in these like spaces that were like just completely suffocating and smelled horrific. And that was also, I mean, I guess part of this is the way that what I was talking about earlier, this attribution that like some people smell, worse, or that one can kind of like tell racial difference based on smells. That one thing that kind of covers over is the way that like the kinds of smells that people experience and sometimes even embody, that's very much related not to kind of biological differences, right, but to environmental differences, different living and working situations, class difference, and so forth. So, that happened, in various kinds of contexts of anti-Blackness, right? So like enslaved people's living situations in cities after the Great Migration and so forth. And I've also worked on anti-Asian discourses that attributed, things like the smell of opium or the smells of like really closely, just like overcrowded living situations to Chinese immigrants, especially, well, starting in the later 19th century in the US. You also mentioned settler colonialism, so I guess I would just say briefly that in that case, indigenous people have, like either been displaced from lands where they have like really important olfactory connections, right, across species boundaries with like different plants and non-human animals that involve like ceremony and like cosmologies, so stories of like how they fit into the world. But even in cases where indigenous people haven't been displaced, like settler colonialism and just like, Western development, right? Settler society basically has like changed the smell of the land, right? By introducing industry or invasive species and so forth.
Well, and Alexandra, building on what Sean just shared, because you've written about olfactory from a gender and sexuality lens. So, can you tell us more about how that plays into our conversation here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Sean set up a really great foundation for understanding the history of perfume and of fragrance as well in terms of gender and sexuality, because all of those racialized categories of smell that he spoke of also play into the uses of perfume early on as well. And to understand the queerness of perfume, I turned to a scholar named Lamonda Horton Stallings and her work on funk. And what she does is she rethinks the funkiness and quote unquote stinkiness that has historically been assigned to the peoples that Sean was just speaking of, to embrace that funk as a sort of way to reorder and decolonize one's sense of smell. And I think that perfume plays a pretty interesting role here because it has that potential to mess up or play with these historical binaries between bad stink or bad funk and quote unquote good smell.
And so Davina, our wonderful intern, has given me some perfumes where vanilla is a key note here. And so while I do some more spritzing, Allie, you are a defender of vanilla, and it's a smell that's been gendered as feminine. But you also argue that's way more complicated, giving it sort of history and how it's cultivated. So do you have anything you want to add in terms of why are you a defender of vanilla?
Yeah, so I think vanilla in kind of our contemporary so-called Western culture is kind of associated with whiteness, childhood, comfort, maybe kind of blandness or something kind of basic. And vanilla itself is completely different to all of that. It's this really dark, black, viscous thing and is incredibly difficult to cultivate and really only grows in one specific part of the world. And a fun fact about the cultivation of vanilla is that the person who discovered how to better cultivate vanilla by hand pollinating the vanilla orchid flowers was actually a freed slave named I think it's Edmund Albion. Does anyone know? Edmund Albius.
We'll do a little checking after this.
um, and yeah, I think it the way that we think about vanilla is really tied up with this idea that everything in our kind of privileged Western societies is so easily accessible to us now. You know, you can go to your local shop and you can buy some vanilla extract and nobody really thinks too hard about the hands through which that particular product has gone through in order to get it to us, and the air miles that have been accumulated in order to transport it. And so, yeah, I'm really invested in rethinking the kind of histories of these things that we take for granted.
And you
Can I
mentioned,
jump in
sure,
here?
go for it, Sean.
Yeah, so there's this queer diasporic perfumer, Bangladeshi American named Tanais, who writes about in their memoir Insensorium about one of the perfumes that they make. They have a perfuming house, among also being a novelist and a memoirist and just wonderful thinker. And this perfume is called Lover's Rock, and they really framed the perfume and their thinking around it and design of the perfume as this like attempt to kind of provide a counter narrative of vanilla. Right, so they want it to not be innocent and to return it to this kind of like sense of dark viscosity that Ali was talking about. They create the perfume in memory of like one of their past lovers, and they really like try to make the vanilla come across as like just like sexy and embodied, and like as I think they talk about it specifically as like dark, right? So it just seems like a great example of what Ali's talking about.
Well, and as I'm smelling the samples that I was given, it definitely smells a lot more than when I say just, right? Like just vanilla. It's like a lot of layers. I'm still getting that warm muskiness from the previous perfume, but I think it's also a part of the ones that I just smelled. So it's just one of those things where I feel like it's a lot more, things are usually a lot more layered than you expect when you come in with sort of a perception of what you think the thing is. And especially so for Alexandra, with what Ali and Sean just shared, because you also talked a lot about the AIDS and HIV epidemic in the context of deoralization. So first of all, what does that mean, and what does that matter in this context?
I think it's interesting to think about deodorization in the context of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, because by the 90s, mainstream perfume had this sort of shift. So pre this era, perfumes were really invested or featured, I guess, a lot of really bold. Um, I don't know if you've ever smelled a vintage perfume, but it has a sort of like growl to it in terms of very animalic features, like Brittany was discussing in the previous segment as well. But after excuse me, after the HIV and AIDS epidemic, there was this shift for perfume to suddenly become this very close to the skin, clean, separate from others sort of thing that was less about let me announce myself in the room and more about, okay, how do I become, stay as close as possible to my the borders of my body. And what's also interesting to note, I think, as well, is that these skin scents, I guess we'll call them, is were also marketed as unisex. And what this also offered is, if we're thinking about the 90s as maybe a point where there's a rise in female workers in the workforce, there's also this promise then to be taken more seriously because it's now uncoupled from a femininity and a loud and proud celebration of the body. But what I was interested in as well is niche perfumers' work in creating smells that actually focus on bodily fluids, and that play a part in healing this erotic relationship to oneself and to others that was broken by the fear and paranoia of queerness that the HIV and AIDS epidemic era produced, and we still see today as well.
Well, and I want to get to Sean here because just we've been talking about sort of the relationship of scent and people, but in many ways, perfume comes from extraction. Otherwise, we wouldn't have these scents, right? So, can you tell us more about the relationship between fragrance and the way we interact with the environment from where it's made from?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that got me interested in studying smell is that it's, as Ali mentioned, it's, this like sense that like evolved and that we kind of access just like early on, right? So before language, before vision. And it's been talked about as this medium of communication that crosses the lines of species. So animals and plants communicate with each other through smells. One of the writers that I find really helpful for thinking about this is the Potawatomi plant scientist Robin Wall Kimmerer, who has this wonderful book called Braiding Sweetgrass, where she talks about the just like the importance of sweetgrass in like Potawatomi and Anishinaabe ceremony, stories, understandings of their place in the world. And the example there is that sweetgrass kind of, evolved to the smell to communicate with some humans who smell it and then harvest it in responsible ways so that the sweetgrass grows back stronger. And then the humans can incorporate that sweetgrass into, whether it's basket weaving, which has like, happens in community and so builds community, also can be used for ceremony and other kinds of just like both use value and to sell at the market. So it just plays all of these social roles as well. Another example, just really quickly, that I find really powerful is the Métis artist and writer Warren Carreyrou, who he works with bitumen, which is a photosensitive material and a kind of like viscous, like almost solid form of petroleum. But he makes photographic images out of it. But he talks about sourcing, so looking for bitumen one day, and like guided by indigenous people who had told him where to find it, and he finds this like landscape that was near the Athabasca tar sands region, but was not extracted, right? So it hadn't yet been kind of like dug into and fracked and whatever. And he has this revelation that the smell of bitumen is not like noxious and headache inducing the way that he had always learned it was, but actually smelled wonderful. And for him, that this is a lesson in like how it's not that the bitumen is toxic, it's how we relate to the land, how we extract it, that is the issue.
Well, and before we go to break, Ali, I do want to kind of bring us to a different kind of landscape, building on what Sean just shared too, because you've been asked on X to analyze certain comments on the internet about smell. So we'd love to know more about how is the internet and smell interacting with each other. Never thought that was going to be a question.
Oh, well, the internet is a public domain. And so I'm constantly engaging with people kind of across categories. And it's really fun actually to hear the public bring their own particular like cultural and individual experiences to the table when we're discussing smell, because something about smell is that, even though it's largely kind of dismissed or overlooked, everybody has their own unique history with it. And people actually, once you get them talking about smell, are really excited to share the way that they relate to it. And so yeah, that's the kind of positive. That's the positive side. The negative side is that I'm kind of constantly intervening in discussions of olfactory othering, what we were talking about earlier, in which people typically are ascribing, i.e., they're applying these particular terms to usually marginalized groups in order to kind of demean or other them and to create a kind of disgust or contempt among fellow internet users without really having to appeal to reason. So the thing that I think is maybe the most prevalent at the moment is this discourse surrounding the Indian body. There's this, it's been memeified. There are these two kind of memes that are constantly floating around the internet. One is like, I know it smell crazy in there. And they are constantly applied specifically to the kind of South Asian body and the Indian community, and it's really done kind of lasting damage to these people, because it is dehumanizing when we talk about people in this way.
And we'll be continuing this conversation after a quick break. You'll be listening to Dr. Ali Lukes, Professor Sean Shu, and Alexandra Siegel, and they'll be staying with us to talk more about the ways perfumes can be both playful and empowering. This is Where We Live. We'll be back after a quick break. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're taking a nosedive into the world of smell and the hidden ways it influences our lives, culture, and politics. So, Alexandra, I want to jump straight back to you here because you talk about the connection between scent and anti-migrant policies in your dissertation. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I think, the majority of that topic has been discussed by Sean and Ali as well. But I think one thing that I will add in terms of perfume is this opportunity that it presents to take some autonomy over the ways that we show up in community and in spaces by having our bodies literally be perceived by others through the senses. And this is one of the ways that Stallings, who I mentioned earlier, refers to with the funk concept in terms of retraining our senses to reorder how we interpret, a bad smell or a good smell. And I think perfumers play with this concept so much, and I think that is some really important work in reordering our senses and bringing to light the power of the sense of smell to do some pretty important work of resistance as well.
Well, and Sean, Alexandra just mentioned the power of fragrance, and you've talked about a particular fragrance house earlier, Studio at Tanya's, and how one fragrance, Mala, uplifted the stories of incarcerated women. So what are other ways can fragrance or smell be a form of empowerment? And just for listeners, I did just spritz Mala as well, and it gives me a sense of sort of like incense and saffron, kind of like a lot of these senses that we are smelling today are very warm. So I think with that context in mind, Sean, can you talk about what are some ways that fragrance can be a form of empowerment?
Yeah, so I think I want to clarify. My understanding is that so the Mala project that Tanais did was where they made like a series of different perfumes for incarcerated women. So that's based on like interviews with these formerly incarcerated women of their memories of like meaningful smells from, before they were incarcerated, and then trying to make these perfumes that I understand as being just like trying to reintegrate their lives, right, across this like gap in time where they were not in control of the air they breathed. So they all, describe the smells of their carceral spaces as either chemical cleaners or just like really bad smells, right? Or the smells like of their own bodies, etc. And so I think of kind of like what that makes clear is that like incarceration is this kind of like interruption in time, right? And in one's kind of like connections across time and across community, and that like creating these perfumes that try to integrate back those like meaningful memories and scents is, I think for Tanais is a way to kind of like try to reintegrate all of that. So they also have the separate perfume called Mala, which I think is based on their travels in, I want to say, Kolkata. And yeah, so I guess just to go back though to the Mala project, right? I think that one of the things that gets at is the really like powerful way in which smell can create these connections across time with the past, with kin, whether like old like kin that one already has or future kin, right? So it can kind of make new memories, as Ali was talking about earlier. And that seems really powerful to me, and that I think gets at how access to scents that might be kind of stigmatized or rendered unavailable. Like one of the smells I talk about is mustard oil, right, which is like a really important culinary material in Southeast Asia, South Asia, so might have like some of the same memory capacities as like the Madeleine that Proust writes about that Ali was discussing earlier. But that has been prohibited in the US and in Europe for culinary use, right? So that actually like limits people's access to this kind of like capacity to have those memories activated.
Well, and as everyone's sharing their stories, I'm actually thinking, for a show called Where We Live, we're thinking about the scents around where we live and the air around us. And I think I want to ask this question to both Ali and Alexandra. Start with Ali here. How can we interrogate our own relationship to smell, and how can we think of it more critically and intentionally? Got about a minute here.
Gosh, that's a big question. I think just showing an interest in the kind of systemic features of the way that of the places that we engage with, actually, because the way that a place smells is so shaped by much broader patterns and issues. So, for instance, there's this kind of uh, general myth that we live in a deodorized society. And partly that's because a lot of the kind of key odorizing infrastructure, like animal agriculture and energy sources and that kind of thing, have been moved out to the countryside and away from kind of dense urban populations. And so what we've done there is we haven't deodorized anything. We've just displaced the smells. And then they become perhaps someone else's problem, someone who lives in the countryside, for instance. And in some situations, those particular displaced smells are a real problem for communities who are not typically regarded as important and whose voices are not heard. So those are the kind of people who are living in poverty, and also racialized communities who are forced to live with these kind of foul odors. So an example of this, for instance, is AI data centers being positioned in predominantly poor Black neighborhoods across the US. That is a kind of systemic issue. And so when we are engaging with the smells of our environment, I would encourage people to think about why certain places we think of them as deodorized and why other places are kind of burdened with odor.
Well, and Alexandra, about 30 seconds here, but how can we think more critically about the smells that we smell around us?
One way through fragrance is that I would say is to play with your perfumes and your colognes and any other kind of scented materials you have. As Sean writes about, smell can enable a sort of time travel. And the way that I think about this in a gendered sense is with Elizabeth Freeman's term of temporal drag, in terms of perfume, is structured by top, middle, and base notes. And what kind of journey does it take us on through our skin? What are the relationships we can build with the fluid as we put it on our skin? And where in time and which, historical conceptions of gender does it take us to past, present, and future? And how do we exaggerate that and play with that and experiment with that?
Certainly have changed our minds about smell and we'll be more sensitive to it. You've been listening to Alexandra Siegel, who's a graduate of Wesleyan University. Alexandra, appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're also listening to Sean Shu, who's a professor of English at UC Davis and author of The Smell of Risk and Olfactory World Making. Sean, appreciate your time as well.
Thank you, Catherine.
And also Dr. Ali Lukes, who's a supervisor at the University of Cambridge. Look out for her trade book that's coming out next year. Ali, thank you so much for joining on Where We Live today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Today's show is produced by Davina Cordero. Our technical producer is Eugene Amatruda. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you all so much for listening. And hey, happy smelling, everyone.